So I've said a few times now that we're getting close to the end of the Old Testament history, and I can finally tell you something solid. This is the first of two parts. After next week, this course will no longer be an Old Testament history survey course. It will be a more exclusively what we have from other historical documents, what we know of the time between the Old and New Testament, which means probably it'll take more preparation time for me. But also a lot of it is stuff that I've gone over already and have slides for. So it's going to change a little bit, but this is the second to last before we reach the end of what the Old Testament records of the history of Israel. So last week, we looked at the first return, and it wasn't just one return, all of the Jews coming out of captivity, returning to Jerusalem at once. It happened in phases, and a lot of them never actually returned and were still scattered throughout the world even after the end of the exile. But the first group that came back was led by Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest, and they laid the foundations for the temple. They were discouraged by the neighboring countries for a while, specifically the Samaritans, the people who had mingled with the other nations, wanted to participate in the building of the temple, but had been so polluted with idolatry, they had abandoned the true religion that God had set up, and Zerubbabel and Joshua said, no, you have no part in this with us, and that caused a lot of really hard feelings, and it's important to remember that. That's going to come up again today and several times, actually, even up until the time of Jesus. This was a sore spot between the Samaritans and the Jews. So they finished building the temple with encouragement from Haggai and Zechariah. And in Ezra, at the beginning of chapter 5, and this is where we ended last week, the prophets, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Joshua the son of Jozadak arose and began to rebuild the house of God which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. And that return began in the time of Cyrus the Great. He liberated the captives from Babylon in 539 BC. Not just the Jews, but other nations as well. And Cyrus is an interesting character in the Bible. Very unique in some ways. Isaiah chapter 44. We don't really know much about, what was going on in somebody's heart, what they actually believed. It's hard to say. There were a lot of things that he did just because he was a pagan king. He was involved in paganism. But he also, in the words we have recorded by him in Ezra and at the end of Chronicles, he gives glory to God, and how much of that is him being honest and how much of that is him being polite and acknowledging their views. We don't know. But Isaiah 44, verse 27. Okay, so way down at the bottom of chapter 44. It is I who says to the depth of the sea, be dried up, and I will make your rivers dry. God talking, obviously. And it is I who says to Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and all my good pleasure he will complete. and saying of Jerusalem, she will be built, and the temple, your foundation will be laid. Thus says Yahweh to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken hold of by his right hand, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will shatter the doors of bronze and cut through the iron bars. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden wealth of secret places, so that you may know that it is I, Yahweh, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name. For the sake of Jacob my servant and Israel my chosen one, I have also called you by your name. I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising to the setting of the sun that there is no one besides me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other, the one forming light and creating darkness, producing peace and creating calamity. I am Yahweh who does all these. So this is God introducing himself to a pagan king, saying, I am calling you by name. I am using you for my purposes. And Isaiah himself lived how many years before Cyrus? He was absolutely dead by the time Cyrus was born. Okay, so there are many scholars who would still see this as a prophecy, but say this was included in the book of Isaiah, but written later, like after Cyrus was alive, because it addresses him by name. And that's not typically what we see in Bible prophecy, right? That's rare. But it is not the only place it happens. There's another person who was referenced by name in a prophecy that we've seen already, one of the kings of Judah, and that was Josiah. Do you remember when that was prophesied? When he was referred to by name in a prediction? No? Okay, it was the man of God who came from Judah to the altar in Bethel right after it was constructed and said, there will be a king of Judah named Josiah who will come and tear down this altar, sacrifice the priests of the altar on it, and defile it. So it's not the only time that this has happened. And I personally lean very, very heavily toward the idea that it was a part of the original book of Isaiah and that it was written before Cyrus was born or named, because the name of Cyrus, the fact that God calls Cyrus by his name, is itself a sign to Cyrus that the prophecy is legitimate. It's meant to be an impressive thing, a confirmation that the words are true. So it's it's more than possible that Cyrus was shown this prophecy, that it was read to him, and that it had something to do with his decision to command the temple to be rebuilt. Because he says in Ezra, in the first chapter, in the first chapter of Ezra, verse 2, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, which is, you may have noticed what God is typically called in Persian culture, in the book of Daniel, in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is typically how God is referred to, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So Cyrus is claiming God gave me this job. and now I am carrying it out, which he does in Isaiah. So that's just a cool thing. But again, we don't know that much about Cyrus's spiritual state, just that he was obedient to God, that he recognized that in this instance. So Ezra, since we're here, chapter 4, and I know we were just in chapter 5, and so this is going backwards a little bit. But what we have in the middle of Ezra chapter 4, it's hard to tell. It doesn't immediately stand out to us, but it would stand out to anyone who was familiar with these kings and when they ruled in Persia. We have kind of a parentheses, a description of things that happened in the middle of Ezra chapter 4 that don't fit into the chronology of what's happening with the temple. So, starting in verse 4 of chapter 4, the people of the land, and we saw this last week, discouraged the people of Judah and dismayed them from building. So, building the temple specifically. They hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So beginning in the time of Cyrus and going to the time of Darius, not Darius the Mede, another confusing thing here, but this is Darius the first, king of Persia, different guy. But starting in verse 6, it says, now in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And that's all it says about this accusation. And right now, the author of Ezra, very likely Ezra himself, is proving the point that these people opposed the work that God was doing, that they were an obstacle to the Israelites. And so he's describing in verse 6 and on, not their opposition to building the temple, but their opposition to repairing the city walls and rebuilding the city. Okay, and that happened in the reign of Ahasuerus, first of all, and apparently that letter was ignored because we don't see any kind of response from it. It just mentions that it was written. And Ahasuerus, this guy, is recognized by the vast majority of people to be Xerxes the first, king of Persia, and the same king talked about in Esther. But he's just very briefly mentioned here, and he doesn't give a response to the people who are trying to get the building stopped. And we're going to come back to Ezra, so hold that in your head, that this is talking about the city and the walls here in the middle of chapter 4. And just read the beginning of Esther. So just after Ezra and Nehemiah. The first few verses. Now it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. First of all, that is a huge area, from India to Ethiopia. That's the extent of the known world at that time, really, in those directions at least. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he held a feast for all his princes and servants, the military officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. while he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. So, and it goes on to describe it in more detail, the lavishness of this feast. And Xerxes became king of Persia, as it says, in about, there's the C there, circa, about 518 BC. And of course, we're familiar in the beginning of the book of Esther. You have the whole incident with Vashti and her getting divorced. And there's a time gap after that happened before Xerxes began, or Ahasuerus began thinking, okay, now how do I make myself happy now that Vashti's out of my life? And during that time gap, the big thing that happened was Xerxes tried very unsuccessfully to conquer Greece. He got a long way, actually. He got as far as Athens. He defeated Athens, but there were a lot of defeats along the way, and even the victories were not amazing victories. If anyone remembers the movie 300 when that came out, I never saw it, but it was a big thing. The very famous battle at Thermopylae. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but King Leonidas of Sparta led a very small group, including 300 Spartans, but some other people as well. The Spartans were the ones who stuck it out, and they were ultimately defeated, but they stopped Xerxes for a long time. And one of the most famous last stands in history. But that was part of this campaign. That's something Xerxes did, and it didn't go his way. He suffered a series of defeats, got scared once he was in Greece that the Grecians were going to come around behind him and cut him off. He wouldn't be able to escape. So he himself abandoned the campaign, left his soldiers there, and they continued to be defeated and eventually gave up. So the mood that we find Xerxes in after these events in the book of Esther is not necessarily a good one. And he was very self-indulgent, just kind of, became more focused on domestic affairs and his harem and that sort of thing, for a while at least. So that campaign was in 480 BC. And then we have the rest of the events of the book of Esther, which of course would have been a lot more historically significant and memorable for the Jews themselves than for most of the other people. And the book of Esther has been assumed to be fictional by a very large number of people. It's kind of right up there with Jonah, as far as the books of the Bible that people really doubt, did this happen? Because there are a lot of things in the book of Esther that feel like exaggerations. One of those things is Xerxes' feast and how lavish it was. But archaeology has really confirmed that, yeah, those numbers are actually pretty accurate. That kind of display of wealth would not be unheard of at all from him. The height of the gallows that Haman builds. I mean, people do some pretty crazy and eccentric stuff in this story. It doesn't necessarily make the story untrue. And the best argument for it being a true story, and it's not a fatal blow to the Word of God if it has fictional stories in it, right? I mean, Jesus's parables were fictional, but it does sound like history. It's written like history. It makes reference to real people, real events, real places. And the best reason to believe that it is not a fictional story and not meant to be is the fact that the feast of Purim comes out of it. The end of the book of Esther, they begin to celebrate the events of Esther, the deliverance that God gave them through the Feast of Purim. And they still do that today. It's a very significant thing. And the celebration means absolutely nothing if it's not based on real events. There's no explanation for why this feast exists if they couldn't look back to a time when God rescued them in this way. So I'm not going to go over all of the events in the book of Esther. We're pretty familiar with it already, I think. Instead, we're going to go back to Ezra. And we saw in Ezra 4:6, they sent a letter to Ahasuerus trying to get the building stopped. That letter, nothing came of it. But in verse 7 of chapter 4, it says, in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Meredith, Tabel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. So Artaxerxes was Xerxes' son, or Ahasuerus' son. I don't know. I think I'm not, yeah, there is confusion about Xerxes' wife or wives. How many he had, what positions they were in exactly. And yeah, that's one of the biggest reasons that people doubt the book of Esther is because we have other information about other, we have other descriptions of Xerxes' family life that don't seem to fit. His wife, the heir of his son, Artaxerxes, doing things that we would not expect Esther to do, some really crazy bad things, and also being married to him later than Vashti should have been. So there's something going on that we don't know about that whole situation. But as far as I know, I don't think we have reason to believe that Esther herself was Artaxerxes' mother. So, but I suppose it's within the realm of possibility, since there is a lot we don't know about that time. But yep, this is Artaxerxes the First. No, it's a good question. Thank you. And Artaxerxes the First becomes an important person in the story from this point on. One of the things that he did, he answered this letter, he made the decision to stop the construction of the city walls. Not the temple, actually, like I said, Ezra 4:6 through 23 is parentheses. Okay, so that's not talking about the building of the temple. So if you read from verse 5, they hired counselors against them to frustrate the council all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Then go down to verse 24. Then the work on the house of God in Jerusalem stopped, and it was stopped until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Okay? So during the reign of Darius, they tried to oppose the building of the temple, and until the second year of Darius, they succeeded. But in the second year of Darius, that's when Haggai and Zechariah began prophesying. So yes, it's confusing the way that it's laid out. But again, if you knew the names of these kings, if you were familiar with the history itself, it would be a lot less confusing. So what happens in this parenthetical portion has to do not with the temple itself, but with the walls. So Artaxerxes the First received a letter from the enemies of Israel, and down in verse 12, Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city, are completing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now let it be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt and the walls are completed, they will not give tribute, custom, or toll. It will damage the revenue of the kings. And they go on to say, yeah, the reputation of Jerusalem in the past, because they were dominated by Assyria, by Babylon before this point, and they had a tendency to rebel, to go their own way, to not like other nations over them. And the other nations are using this to their advantage and convincing Artaxerxes the first, you need to stop this. You need to stop them from building the walls, making this a fortification, or they will resist your authority. They will see themselves as independent and cut you off from this portion of your empire over here. You're going to lose power in this area. So the king, down in verse 17 and following, sent an edict to them. In verse 18, the document which you sent to us has been plainly read before me. So a decree has been issued by me, and a search has been made, and it has been found that the city has lifted itself up against the kings in past days, that rebellion and revolt have been perpetrated, there it is, in it, that strong kings have been over Jerusalem, even rulers in all the provinces beyond the river, and that tribute, custom, and toll were given to them. Now issue a decree to make those men stop, that this city may not be rebuilt until a decree issued by me. So Artaxerxes I stopped the construction of the walls. And again, the temple was already completed by this time. So let's hop ahead to Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7. At the beginning, we have a confirmation that now we're up to speed. What we looked at before was stated ahead of the time it actually happened. Now we are in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, after these things. And in that time, there went up Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Marioth, son of Zerahiah, son of Uzi, son of Buki, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the chief priest. So Ezra is part of that chosen line out of Aaron's sons, the son Phinehas and his descendant Zadok. That's the line that God has specifically made a promise to. You will be my priests. And Ezra himself is not described as a priest, he is a scribe. This Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses, which Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all he requested, because the hand of Yahweh his God was upon him. And some of the sons of Israel, and some of the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. And he came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. For on the 1st of the month he began to go up from Babylon, and on the 1st of the 5th month he came to Jerusalem, because the good hand of his God was upon him. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of Yahweh and to practice it and to teach his statute and judgment in Israel. So that's what Ezra is setting out to do. That's his role, his job. He's getting permission from the king to go, not to rebuild anything, not to restore social order, but to teach the people the law of God, to reestablish the proper worship, the proper understanding of who they are as the people of God and how they ought to live. So, and it gives a copy of the letter that Artaxerxes gave to Ezra. And Ezra praises God down in verse 27. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of our fathers, who has put such a thing as this in the king's heart, to beautify the house of Yahweh, which is in Jerusalem. Because the temple being built already, one of the things the king did was send a lot of wealth with Ezra to Jerusalem to, as he says, beautify the house of Yahweh, and has extended loving kindness to me before the king and his counselors, and before all the king's mighty princes. Thus I was strengthened according to the hand of Yahweh my God upon me, and I gathered chief men from Israel to go up with me. And before we close, let's hop over to chapter 8. Just finish up this slide. So Ezra is in a little bit of a precarious position here. It is an enormous amount of wealth. If you read the description in Artaxerxes' letter, it's a huge amount of wealth that they're transporting, that they've gathered. In verse 21, then I called for a fast there at the river of Ahava, where they had gathered, that we might humble ourselves before our God and seek from him a direct journey for us, for our little ones and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to ask from the king for a military force and horsemen to help us against the enemy on the way. Because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is upon all those who seek him, for their good, but his strength and his anger are against all who forsake him. So we fasted and sought our God concerning this matter, and he was moved by our entreaty. So, because of the claims that Ezra and those with him had made about the power of God and his ability to protect, they would have been going against what they said. They would have been demonstrating a lack of faith before the king if they had asked him for protection on the way. So they're making this journey to Jerusalem with all of this wealth completely unprotected, without any guards at all, which from a human standpoint would be an incredibly bad idea, but God protected them and confirmed the claims that they had made before the king, that God would keep them safe. And we're going to pick up next week with what happened in Jerusalem with Ezra and later with Nehemiah, and what this spiritual reformation looked like that they accomplished. Any questions about any of that? Yeah. They're still a witness to the nation, even without trying to. They are a witness of the power and goodness of God, of his blessing and his might. It's just the role they've always played. It's the role they're still playing in world history. All right. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father, thank you so much for your word and how reliable it is, that we can trust it. Thank you that you've worked in such wonderful ways in the hearts of even pagan people people that didn't know you or acknowledge you, that you've used them for your purposes. Please use us as willing vessels. Help us to be true to what you've called us to do, to have courage, knowing how in control you are, and how firmly we can lay hold of your promises. In Jesus' name, amen.